for the Cache Valley League of Women Voters, and we are glad to have this session tonight, both for ourselves, but also for our community to hear more about the current redistricting efforts and the lawsuit around that. So joining us tonight is Katie from Better Boundaries, Laura from the Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and David, who is one of the attorneys on the case. I will let them introduce themselves a little bit more fully in regards to exactly what their role is in this process, but I want to be sure to give them as much time as possible, since I know this is one that might generate a lot of questions as well. So I think I'm handing it off to Katie first, if I'm not mistaken, and I will let you all take it from here. And quick reminder, though, we won't have a meeting in July, as it's the week of July 4th, but we will have our next meeting on the first Wednesday of August, and we'll send out an email to our listserv about it. And that is all for us. And go ahead, Katie.
Just give me a minute. I'm trying to figure out why it won't let me share my screen. So I'm just.
Oh, yeah. And let me make sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's on your end. I think it's on mine, which is very odd because I share my screen all the time and now it's telling me. There we go, I think. Let me try one more thing. Sorry about that. Well, I was just going to start off with introductions. So maybe I'll do that because then I can hand it to David and Laura for a minute. But my name is Katie Wright. I'm the executive director at Better Boundaries. I've been there for almost a year and have worked hard to learn everything that is to be known about redistricting in Utah, but I don't. And that's why I have two amazing people with me, David Reymann and Laura Lewis Iwi. Did I get that right? Sorry, Laura. So I'm going to hand it to them to do quick introductions, and then I'm going to do sort of a background and history of how we got to the point of the litigation. I'm going to hand it to David to talk about the legal stuff, and then Laura is really going to tell you from the plaintiff organization perspective of MWAG of why this issue is so important to them, like it's important to the League of Women Voters. So, oh, Laura was saying she can share the presentation. That would be great. If you're able to do that, I would appreciate it.
Sounds good. Just give me a second here.
Okay, so David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I hate introducing myself, so I'll try and make it short. My name's David Reymann. I'm an attorney at Parr, Brown, Loveless, which is a big firm in Salt Lake. We do all kinds of different stuff, and they indulge me in doing things like this when we find things that we're passionate about. And but most of the time, I'm a commercial litigation trial lawyer. I don't get to work on things I believe in all the time. So this is a real gift to be able to work on things that you believe in. I know no matter what job you have, that's maybe a rarity, but at least for lawyers, you don't get to bring cases. You always are dependent on people who are willing to fight the fights that you are willing to fight for them. And so I want to thank all of you for taking on this fight. But we'll talk a little bit more in the presentation in a minute about the legal team that Better Boundaries has helped assemble for this fight. I have been brought in primarily as trial counsel because the case right now is in what's called the district court in Utah, which is the first level. Everybody expects that eventually it'll end up in the Utah Supreme Court. And I also do a lot of appellate work, and I work with the appellate lawyers on this case as well. So I'll probably be involved there as well. But right now the case is in what's called the trial court or the district court. And so I am one of the lawyers, and there's another partner at my firm, Briggs Matheson, who many of you may know. His dad, Scott Matheson. He's also working with me on the case, and we have agreed to do this for a much reduced rate because we believe in what you guys are fighting for, and so I'm excited to be part of the team.
Awesome, thank you. And Laura, do you want to introduce yourself, and thank you for getting the presentation up?
Yeah, no problem. So Laura Lewis, I'm the communications specialist for Mormon Women for Ethical Government here in Utah. and have just been working on redistricting for the last while. I was represented MWEG on the redistricting coalition, and then when we were invited to join the lawsuit, have just been one of the communication specialists since then. And I'll talk more about it, but just this is like the League of Women Voters. This is an issue that we are very passionate about and very honored to be involved with.
All right, if you want to just go to 2 more slides, and I'll just ask you to move forward when I think we did that one. All right, so I like to kick off all my presentations with this tweet, because on December 27th, the national organization, the Redistrict Network, posted this, and I felt seen, like, yes, what has happened in Utah has just been a travesty. And, we had been working, all of us, the League, Mormon Women, so many groups, so hard. And to have the legislature just ignore the will of the people, go behind closed doors, and forward maps that really slice and dice communities was heartbreaking. But I'm feeling much more positive now. So we had that moment, and then the next slide, fast forward to March 17th, and we're standing on the steps of the Capitol announcing the complaint with just an incredible group of legal experts and plaintiffs like the League and Mormon Women for Ethical Government, who were willing to put this intense effort on behalf of Utahns everywhere from across the state. And I just felt so positive. And part of the reason why I felt so positive is everything that was in the complaint. Because all the actions that everyday regular folks had taken to secure independent maps within the complaint. And so it really helped me see that despite the setback, we continue to make progress. So let's get to start at the beginning. There had been many efforts to bring independent redistricting to Utah prior to the founding of Better Boundaries, but we came into being in 2017 with the laser focus on the idea that voters should not choose their politician. So in 2018, we worked really hard to get Proposition 4 on the ballot, and then it passed by a majority of Utahns. However, like the 3 other propositions that passed that year in a voter initiative, we had to spend a couple years really defending that with the legislature, because ultimately what they did is they repealed Prop 4 and instead enacted a very watered down version. Then in 2021, we went through the adoption process and really saw a really spectacular job by the Independent Redistricting Commission, which I will get into. And now here we are in 2022, supporting the lawsuit. And I think it's important to note that our role in the lawsuit is really as we're on your team in terms of we are rooting for you. We are raising money to pay for the financial costs of it. And then, of course, we're continuing to communicate and educate Utahns about why redistricting and independent redistricting is really important. Next slide. So to get Proposition on the ballot, we had 190,000 people who signed that. And I know that that was an effort that the League of Women Voters Utah had a huge role in. And then, like I said, it passed with more than 500,000 votes. And I think it's important to note because it didn't pass with a huge majority, that it did pass with much greater margins than most candidates. So people ask, like, do you really have bipartisan support? But we certainly have the support of a majority of Utahns. And that was true all across the state in rural and urban areas. Next slide. So what happened? We passed it and we got to this fall and we have an independent commission. So when I think about what happened this fall, I think about really 3 legs of a stool. So you can go to the next slide. We have what happened with the independent commission, what did the public hear, and then what happened politically. And I'll break it down before we get into everything else. So the independent commission, next slide. So one of the greatest successes and signs of progress here in Utah is that we have a proof of concept. At Better Boundaries, we really believed that politicians, like most humans, are inherently self-interested. And because they're self-interested, there should be an independent process to draw political boundaries. And if you put together standards that really forward the needs of voters first, like not slicing and dicing cities and counties, then you will get maps that really reflect communities and that are politically neutral. And I have to say, despite the outcome of the maps adopted, our independent commission did an absolutely phenomenal job. We see in other states that they completely break down on partisan lines, and that did not happen in Utah. And I have to give the chair, Rex Facer, a lot of credit for some of his great ideas. So one thing they did is they YouTubed all drawing sessions. So it was completely done in sunshine and still can be viewed right now. And people actually watched all of those. And I can tell you, I'm not that dedicated. I watched some in person, but not videos of videos. The second thing that they did, because it's really a time-consuming task, is that they had to break up in teams. And they made sure that the teams had both Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So not one team was bringing up like a political angle to it. And they really did an excellent job at meeting all the statutes and all the requirements. And we know that because they hired top-notch national map drawers. For example, Professor Nathan Persley out of Stanford, to review their work and measure it and run it through diagnosis to make sure that it met all of the credentials. And this ended with a huge report given to the legislative redistricting committee that really showed their process, their thinking, and it measured specifically that they met the guidelines. I think other states that have independent commissions could learn a lot from some of the best practices that Utah established. Next slide. And another huge win for us was the engagement of Utahns. So I was able to compare to some of our neighboring states in Colorado and Arizona that have, of course, much bigger populations than Utah. And our engagement in terms of draft maps, comments on maps, was either similar or even higher than those states who also have independent commissions and have much, as I said, much bigger population. So there is no doubt in my mind that Utahns really care about this issue, despite its complexity. I mean, it is a challenging issue to engage with, and yet people have really become passionate about it. And one of the examples I like to share is, as many of you probably remember, there was a food tax that was passed, and then there was like a huge uproar, and then it was overturned in the voter referendum. Or there was a threat. I can't remember the exact thing. There were more emails in that week about map adoption than there was around the food tax. And I think that that is a really remarkable indication of how much people are paying attention, and actually the really good work of coalition members like the League and MWAG in getting the word out and getting people activated. Next slide. But of course we had politics, and politics is really where it fell apart. We had a legislative redistricting committee who did what I would call a classic dog and pony show around the state, where they collected input and went behind closed doors and drew the maps the way they wanted. The maps were released on Friday night at around 10:30 p.m. Halloween weekend, and the public meeting was set on Monday. And that room was packed. There was people on that Zoom call for all 5 hours. And again, people asked and demanded a transparent process. But of course, that's not what we got. So this is really where things fell apart. So next slide. So with that, the lawsuit, and I think that's where I hand it over to the legal experts. David.
Sure. Can you all hear me all right? My internet was being weird this morning. Yes? Okay. So you can go to the next one, Laura, if you're controlling it. So let me just say a couple words before. I'm a lawyer and I spend my days with lawyers, and so I tend to get a little bit into the weeds on law stuff, and I just got home from work. as an occupational hazard. So I'm going to try not to get too technical, but if there are things that I say that you all have questions about, I'm happy to go into as much detail as you want in the Q&A. But I'll try and hit just some of the high points. The history of partisan redistricting in the United States, it goes back essentially to the founding of the country. And when you talk to people about this issue from a legal perspective, or even not from a legal perspective, even just talking to your friends, one of the questions that you may get is, well, it's kind of an inherently partisan process, isn't it? I mean, it's drawing districts to try and figure out where to put people, and there's always going to be interests that go into that are related to political parties. And in a sense that is true, and it always has been true. The problem is that concept can be extended so far that it can justify all manners of sins, to the point where, and I'll get to this at the very end, we're now facing an argument essentially that says we can do whatever we want. There's nothing you can do about it. And that can't be right. So in 2019, these cases used to be brought in federal courts. Most of you probably know there's a federal court system and a state court system, and they generally break down around enforcing the US Constitution and federal laws, and the state constitutions and state laws. And most of these cases used to be brought in federal court for many years. And the Supreme Court had even suggested that partisan gerrymandering claims could go too far in federal courts, and the courts could do something about it. In 2019, our current court, Supreme Court, led by Justice Roberts, issued an opinion that basically said the federal courts are getting out of the business of dealing with partisan gerrymandering claims. You can't bring those claims in federal court anymore. But they said at the same time that really where you need to be bringing these claims is in state courts under your state constitutions. Every state's got a constitution or something that is similar that's called something slightly different. And it's interestingly, many of them, and Utah is no exception, have different provisions. They're not just sort of mini US constitutions. They have different provisions in them that are often broader than federal protections, and the area of voting rights is one of those. So what we've seen since 2019, since the Supreme Court withdrew itself from protecting against this kind of tactic, is a number of cases that have been brought in various states under state constitutions. And all of them are slightly different because all of the state constitutions are slightly different, but there are a lot of commonalities. And so the case that we have brought in Utah that was filed a few months ago is just based on provisions in Utah's constitution. And so the final road for us, there aren't any federal questions. The final road for us will be the Utah Supreme Court, just like it has been in other states where similar cases have been brought. And I'll just tick through a couple of these because they're probably not entirely familiar if you're just used to the federal constitution. The main claim in the case is a clause in the Utah Constitution that's called the Free Elections Clause. And that clause essentially says that Utah's elections must be free. And it's been in the Constitution since the founding of the state. And most courts that have interpreted similar language, it was borrowed from other states, and it even has roots back in England, but have said for elections to be free doesn't mean there's just not a poll tax. It means that each person's vote has to be as substantially meaningful as anyone else's, that everyone needs to have a free opportunity to participate in elections on equal terms. And when you gerrymander districts and crack them like our legislature has done, or pack them as some other states have done, in order to consolidate voters or split them apart, and anyone who's a Democrat in Utah or even a moderate Republican knows this, you don't have the same voting power as someone else who's voting for a candidate that's in the favored political majority. And so there's a lot of authority out there that suggests that extreme partisan gerrymandering violates that clause. There are other rights in the Constitution. I'll just say a couple quick things about each of them. Number one says equal protection. Hang on. Sorry, my phone just started ringing. Can you guys still hear me? My phone is all integrated on my computer now. Everything is consolidated on my computer. I don't even have a separate phone. So when one thing goes wrong, like everything goes wrong at once. So I apologize. One thing, if you want to take one thing away from equal protection, because this doesn't just apply to redistricting, and it's this way in a lot of states. Utah's equal protection clause is called the uniform operation of laws, which means that it matters not just what the law says and classifies into different categories, but how it operates in effect. And that's a big deal legally, because the redistricting here, it may look on its face like it's just dividing up people into equal kind of districts, but in effect, the effect is to dilute people's votes. The next two, freedom of association and freedom of speech, are probably familiar to you because they're First Amendment concepts. But the idea here is that when you redistrict in a particular way that punishes people for expressing political views in the past, and that essentially is what redistricting is. It takes past voting pattern data that's based on protected speech, which is what voting is, and divides you into a community that dilutes your vote. It's punishing you for speech, which the government's not entitled to do. It's also preventing you from associating with people, like-minded voters, and that we have two different provisions in Utah's Constitution that are broader than the First Amendment that prohibit that. And the last one is the affirmative right to vote. There's no right to vote actually in the federal Constitution, at least not an express one, but there is one in Utah's Constitution. And our argument is that if the right to vote is to be meaningful, then you can't take people's votes and make them essentially meaningless at the ballot box. You can flip to the next slide, Laura. And then the last claim in the case deals with a lot of what Katie did a good job explaining, which was Prop 4. And it challenges the ability of the legislature to simply turn around and pass a law that just wipes off the books something that the voters pass. And I just wanted to make a quick comment here just to emphasize something that Katie said and the remarkable work that Better Boundaries did and continues to do, but did in getting this passed. I worked on a handful of initiatives over the years, and some of you may have as well. It is really hard to get an initiative passed in Utah. The Constitution vests the power to directly legislate in the people through initiatives and referendums. Referendums repeal laws, initiatives pass them. The people are supposed to have the organic source of power and be able to be co-equal with the legislature in legislating. And over the years, the legislature has sort of, and there's another issue in the news right now that you can probably figure out what the analogy is, but they just continue to chip away and make it harder and harder with signature requirements and time requirements and all of that to get initiatives passed. So when something passes here, even if it's just by the slimmest of majorities, because it's so hard to get people to participate in this process or sign a petition, it is a really compelling illustration of the will of the people in Utah, and 3 of them passed that year, and all 3 were neutered by the legislature, but none, I think, as much quite as Prop 4, which was repealed entirely and replaced with something that they said we'll go through kind of the motions, but we don't have to actually be accountable for anything. So the lawsuit, the last claim in the lawsuit, says that when people are exercising their right to reform their government, which is not every law, but it is this law, the legislature does not have the unfettered power to simply take that away. If that were the case, and their argument is, well, the remedy is just the ballot box, vote us out if you don't like what it is that we do. But when you're actively corroding the very accountability through the laws that they are passing, that argument doesn't work. And so we're not saying that the legislature can't make changes or repeal anything that the voters pass, but in this particular area is kind of a sacred trust bestowed on the people of Utah. Our argument is that they can't. So all of those are constitutionally based claims, and you can flip the slide. And we are, as I mentioned, I won't mention myself again, but my firm is the trial team. Zimmerman Boer is an attorney, as a firm that specializes in appeals. We know this case is going to go up on appeal no matter who wins, and the Utah Supreme Court will have the last say. They are the premier appellate litigation firm in town by a mile. They are, if you're going to do one thing to increase your chances of winning on appeal, it's to hire them. And they've got a lot of former judges over there and people who they specialize just in this, and they've been on the ground from the very start, helping us craft our arguments. And then the one on the far right, CLC, stands for Campaign Legal Center. They are a national nonprofit out of Washington, D.C. that are experts in this area. They file these types of cases all over the country. And they have brought a substantial amount of expertise at both the trial and appellate levels. And we're all working together. I exchanged probably 24 emails today with them, because we had a big filing in the case that I can detail at the very end. And I don't think that's the very last one for me, Katie or Laura, but it might be close. Oh, and this last slide, I won't go through all of this, but it echoes some of what Katie mentioned, that the complaint recounts. And I would encourage you all, if you have a few minutes, it's a long complaint, but it's available. I believe it's probably available on Better Boundaries website and on MWAG's website and probably the League's website. But if you haven't read the complaint, it is kind of infuriating reading in some ways, but also it's sort of like a lot of things in Utah, it sort of makes you feel good when people finally fight back against what we sometimes just have to put in the back of our minds and move on with. And it details a lot of this, how much work went into passing the initiative, all the work that the Independent Redistricting Commission did, the cavalier way in which the legislature just discarded what they did and figured that there would be no accountability for it. And I'll just say, sort of the last thing, where we are in the lawsuit, unless you're getting to that at a different point, Katie, or is this okay for me to say that now?
Yeah. I would love for you to give an update. Okay,
so here's the update. Litigation is a slow process. So let me address just two quick things. Some people have asked us why isn't this going to affect the next election cycle? And it's because litigation is very slow, generally, and frustratingly so. It takes a long time to do things. And sometimes you can get courts to act very quickly, but it is sometimes very difficult to get them to do things of great consequence on a very truncated record. And we have believed from the start that the evidence we will present to the district court mostly through expert testimony, analyzing these maps, is so overwhelmingly persuasive that we wanted to ensure that we had the time to do that. And so this is a decade-long problem that the legislature has created and compounded. And our hope is that we will have a resolution from the Utah Supreme Court in time for the next election cycle starting in 2024. So that brings us to sort of where we are. We've filed a complaint. The legislative defendants, I guess you can turn to the next slide, because I remember there's one that these are the defendants in the case. And the lieutenant governor is just sued because she is technically administering the elections, but she doesn't really have she didn't have an active role in the debacle that we're dealing with. All these other people did, the legislature primarily, but these other individuals, they're all sued in their official capacities. But everyone except for the lieutenant governor filed a motion to dismiss. Then essentially the argument is this. The Constitution says that the legislature has the obligation to redistrict every 10 years. And what that means is that the legislature has the unfettered right to redistrict no matter how they want. And even if they violate the Constitution in doing so, the courts have no role in even considering or assessing whether the maps violate the Constitution. And that's despite the fact that, as we just went through, there are multiple provisions in there that deal with the right to vote, of which redistricting is a major part. In fact, sometimes it's the decisive one. And so just today, we filed a lengthy response that I've gotten to Katie, and I think, Laura, that's coming maybe from CLC to you if you haven't gotten it already. But it was just filed this afternoon that responds and sets out our arguments. We expect in the next several months that will be fully briefed, and the court will set a hearing. And our hope is that the court will reject what the legislature is arguing and say there is a role for the courts to play here. The legislature is not God when it comes to drawing maps. And we will get the chance to proceed to presenting our proof on the merits of why what the legislature did here is so extreme. Even though partisanship is always a part of redistricting, it is so extreme here that it violates the constitutional boundaries that we all live under including the legislature. So that is where we are. And if that happens, we will have a lot more to say once we get past this initial motion stage.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So I'll talk about a little bit about the plaintiffs, and I'm just going to explain from our perspective, from Mormon Women for Ethical Government, who we are, and I think that's important because as a grassroots membership organization, that's one of the reasons that we are involved as one of the plaintiffs, and then why we decided to get involved in the litigation, and what our involvement has been since the beginning, and why we got involved, and then I guess take Q&A after that. But we joined with the league and several individual plaintiffs. Some of the individual plaintiffs are actually MWEG members as well. Malcolm and Victoria Reed. Victoria is a member of MWEG, and they're a husband and wife. One is a Republican, one is a Democrat. But all of these plaintiffs are like individually affected by the gerrymandering. In fact, we were just at an event recently where one of the plaintiffs talked about how she's just like basically walking distance from each of the congressional boundaries. I think 3 of them are within walking distance of her home. So obviously all of these individual plaintiffs have been affected. And MWEG, I'll explain a little bit about our organization. We're a nonpartisan organization. We are made up of like our members represent a broad range of political perspectives. We have Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated, United Utah Party, and so, definitely affected by the gerrymandering of the drawn maps. And just to tell you a little bit about our organization, we're founded on principles of nonpartisanship. Our roots are faithful, nonpartisan, proactive, and peaceful. And then we are founded on 7 principles of ethical government, which I'll get into a little bit. But we hope to promote greater civic engagement, elevate public discourse, prepare women to become ethical leaders and future public servants, and create a more peaceful society. So one of the principles, MWEG's principles of ethical government, is that political structures and electoral systems are designed to maximize participation of and provide equitable access to citizens of a society. And so voting rights is one of our main focus areas of our advocacy work. And so our members, when redistricting, when Better Boundaries spearheaded the redistricting way back several years ago with Prop 4, our members got involved in gathering signatures and supporting Proposition 4 as a really important part of protecting democracy. And then we've been involved ever since then. So we've had members that had published a Deseret News opinion editorial. We provided a lot of educational resources on our website about redistricting and updates of what was going on. We did map making parties so that our members could get involved in drawing and submitting maps to the Independent Redistricting Commission and supporting their efforts, providing comments on their maps, giving public comment to the Legislative Redistricting Commission, and when Governor Cox did not veto the maps that the legislature drew, we came out and with an official statement in support of the Independent Redistricting Commission's maps and urging them to reinstate those and adopt those. We did a call to action that resulted in over 300 letters to the Legislative Redistricting Commission and hundreds of phone calls to our members' representatives. in the state legislature. So it was just a really, really important part of our advocacy work was the supporting the incredible work of the Independent Redistricting Commission and of Better Boundaries and what they're trying to do to protect democracy. So because we are nonpartisan, the decision to become involved was very much principled. We're committed to fundamental democratic principles of equality and fair representation. And when we were approached to join the lawsuit, we just felt like, as an organization dedicated to peacemaking, and as an organization that our ethics and our like religious views, those principles kind of compelled us to become involved and to stand up for what we believed was right. Why litigation? Just I think David did a great job in laying out the importance of it specifically in this instance, and just that it felt we'd been doing the advocacy work for years, and when the legislature decided to discount, I guess, the will of the people and instead put their views ahead of what the people wanted, and putting their protecting themselves over having the people elect their leaders or choose their leaders rather than the other way around, then we decided to just take that next logical step and to become involved, and felt like that was an important way to create peaceful change in our democratic society. So we feel really honored to join with the League and with all of the individual plaintiffs and support the work that Better Boundaries has started, and joining with the excellent legal team. Feel really hopeful. So I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
All right, well, that was a lot of information. So we are looking forward to getting to your questions. So thank you, David and Laura, for super informative. And yeah, Kendra, I'll turn it over to you to manage the Q&A, or people can just unmute and ask questions.
Sure. I think since we don't have too terribly many people on the call, I think we can just see if anyone has questions rather than trying to moderate it, unless someone doesn't feel comfortable asking, and then you're welcome to throw it in the chat. But otherwise, you're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask whatever questions you may have.
I have a question about the lawsuit. So I know, at least on the national scale, it sometimes seems like, just following the Supreme Court, that on these hot button issues, the judges kind of follow the partisan of who appointed them. So I don't know that much about the Utah Supreme Court system, but do you feel like it's kind of similar here, or do you feel like the judges wouldn't be biased towards kind of the Republican legislature?
Yeah, I assume that's for me. We have an outstanding appellate bench in Utah, and I wouldn't say that, just to kiss ass because this recording might get back to them. I grew up in Alabama, and I keep ending up in these super red states. I don't know how this happened, but I grew up in Alabama, and judges there are elected, and you may be familiar with one of them named Roy Moore, who used to be the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. And I won't belabor his exploits, but if you don't know about him, he was removed from the bench because he refused to obey a federal order to remove the 10 Commandments from a courthouse. So anyway, when I came to Utah, I had a direct contrast between whether it was just a red state thing or not. And we don't elect our judges; they're appointed by the governor. Our last two governors and before that even have done an outstanding job with the bench in general. And so we do have some people on the bench that are conservative. We've got some people on the Supreme Court in particular, and some people, we don't know who's going to take the last spot. There's an empty spot right now. But just for years and years, it has just been a spectacular bench. They don't get, the things that get in the news, to answer your question, often tend to be the hot button issues that are political. Most of what comes before them is not. And we don't, and have tried very vigorously from the start to say that this is really not a partisan issue. I mean, the Campaign Legal Center has been involved in cases around the country in red states. For instance, in Maryland, they struck down maps that were drawn by Democrats, and their view and mine is that people shouldn't be rigging the game no matter what party is in charge. And I think that will be our pitch to the court. But I have no worries about not getting a fair shake in front of the Utah Supreme Court.
Awesome, thanks.
We also do have a question in the chat, which I would assume anyone can answer if you have an idea, and it's that what can we do as we wait?
I'll take that one. One thing that an attorney said to me early on in this is that judges are people too. They live here in Utah, they open up the paper, they take their kids to soccer games, and they hear what people are talking about. So that drumbeat that Utahns have been so excellent at in saying this is an important issue and we are paying attention really needs to continue. And so whether or not that's using like your own social media network to post stories, or talking about it with friends, or writing letters, or making it a question you ask campaigning people who are in campaign season, you're raising your hand at public forums and asking them where they stand on government accountability or redistricting in particular. I think all of those actions have a role and are really important.
And I'll just add one thing. I mean, I've had a number of people email me since we filed the case, or contact me and say, what can we ask that exact same question? What can we do to help? I've had lawyers contact me and mostly said, we've got enough lawyers in the kitchen. So the one thing that you can do is just to donate to one of the organizations you believe in, whether it's Better Boundaries or MWEG or the League, that is helping support not only the advocacy work that we're doing, but also the legal fight. I mean, it's not free to fight these kind of fights. It's difficult work. And sometimes money is the best thing that you can give. So that's kind of the advice that I've given to some people who don't know how else to help.
So Christine is asking if the league has a specific donation button. They do on their website, I can say that, but I don't think it necessarily goes direct to this effort. But we could certainly ask them if there's a way to designate a donation, because I know every nonprofit has to have a way to designate what you give if there's something that you're giving to in particular. I don't think any one of our speakers would necessarily know that, but we can certainly find out and let our listserv know how they can give to this process. Does the Mormon Women for Ethical Government I don't know if y'all have a designated way for people to give for this, since y'all are also a nonprofit, but
I think giving specifically to Better Boundaries would be probably the best way to have a donation go directly to the costs of the redistricting litigation.
And that's very generous of MWEG and the league before, and I don't see it now, but I'm probably just not finding it, had, like, if you want to support the donation, it actually went to our page as well. I'll say that I know that both the league and Mormon Women are just lean, small organizations who are taking on this monumental task. So it is, challenging to staff up for that or have the resources to do it well, and it's important. So I think any donation is really well utilized. We do have a match right now for any donation made to the litigation, so made possible by the Cultural Visions Fund. So we're very grateful for that. And we just launched it, and we have to raise $25,000 by August 1st. So that is an option right now.
to give to that, would we just go to your website?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. We'll send out an email tomorrow and we can throw a link in it for everyone to know how to do that.
And I also was going to add, if anyone wants to put their email in the chat, I can add you to our mailing list, and that helps keep really abreast of what's happening. So we try to, draw parallels, like for example, if this just happened in New York or what's happening in Ohio, to give sort of a national perspective, but also keep people up to date about what's happening in Utah. So if that's something you're interested in, please just shoot me your email. My email is katie@betterboundaries.org. I'll make sure you get all the information.
And I don't know if you see it, you might see it, Katie, but
Thank you.
yeah, so you could just tell us more about your organization.
Oh, sorry, I did miss that one. So Better Boundaries, we are a nonpartisan C4 organization, a political advocacy organization. We have been focused solely on redistricting since our founding. Our actual name is Utahns for Responsive Government. And so we are starting to explore, are there government accountability issues that we could have a positive impact on beyond redistricting? But that's sort of in motion. You might know that we also founded a PAC, which is also a nonpartisan PAC. It supports both Republican and Democrat, or fights against Republican and Democrat incumbents based on their, how they voted and advocated or not for fair redistricts or fair districts. And, there really was blame on both party lines. Unfortunately, back to our original thesis that people are self-interested, and in Utah, we really have an incumbency protection problem. And that is a challenge. And so we continue to also fight that on the political side through our PAC, which is a new strategy for us in this election year.
Okay, I have another question for anybody, but is this mainly focused on the districts for the national congressional seats, or are you also challenging the ones for our local senators and representatives?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's only focused on the federal congressional districts for the House. That's not because the state districts are much, if any, better. But sometimes the principles that we're hoping to establish in this case, which have never been really addressed by Utah courts, and some of these constitutional provisions have very, very little. They've been around since 1896, but they've been addressed very little in the intervening years. We're hoping to establish some principles that will will establish accountability across the board. But the direct answer to your question is this lawsuit only seeks relief with respect to the federal congressional districts, but the principles should be generally the same. It's a lot to bite off to fight every, crooked map at once, is the shorter answer to your question. So, but I mean, what the interest, at least this is interesting to lawyers, when the federal courts abdicate in an area and states have to start filling the void and determining what these rights that we've all had for hundreds of years actually mean. They have rarely been called on to do so before. You start seeing some really interesting things arise that don't just depend on where Justice Alito is on it, or you know what I mean. And so I think it's kind of most of the courts that have addressed this, at least so far, have said we can address this, and this is not okay. And these are a lot of sort of, if you're a skier, and I used to be one, but then I had a kid, now I don't ski anymore, but it's like untouched powder, from a legal perspective. You get to kind of craft what the arguments are. And that's one of the things that really intrigued me about this case, is that these are untouched provisions that must mean something. And if they don't mean what they seem to mean here, it's hard to imagine where they would have any application. So.
There's a comment from Christine about some really wrong districts, and I'll point out one that's just almost crazy is Wayne County, I believe, is either, I have a hard time holding numbers in my head, so it's either 2,500 or 4,500 people. It's a very small populated county. It's split into 2 Senate districts. And that's an example of just bad line drawing. You know, you shouldn't split a county of that size. So there are plenty of examples, and we are noting those. And if you have examples, and it's interesting even to hear people on the campaign trail, we had someone at a county convention say, I picked you to be my voters. I could have had this county, but I picked you guys. You know, let us know about that stuff, because we'll put it in the old history archive and maybe pull it out in a future date if that's helpful. So as you're listening to people make unknown foibles, send them our way.
Question
And there-
from, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just saw it in the chat. Is that what you're going to say, Kendra? Yeah, it's probably for me. So it's a good question. I didn't address this. The question is what happens if we win? And the answer is twofold. One is that the court can order, and in some states, the court has even overseen the redrawing of maps that more closely adhere to equitable redistricting and neutral redistricting principles. Whether that's done by the legislature with specific directions from the court, whether it's done by a special master, you know, with directions from the court or oversight, is something that, you know, is something that we'll have to figure out down the road. But the bottom line is the maps need to be redrawn. And the second thing is to reinstate what the voters voted for when they passed Prop 4, and that's to put back in place the mechanism that the voters wanted, the Independent Redistricting Commission, that's not just a paper tiger that the legislature actually has to listen to and to justify, you know, departing from, and with an enforcement mechanism for citizens who feel like their rights have been violated. And the bottom line of that one is just accountability. What we're fighting for, you know, mostly in this fight at a really high level is accountability by people who feel like they are not accountable to the voters anymore. And we are left only with the courts because they have shown contempt for the voters' will. And that is essentially the argument to the courts, is that you are the last hope to try and vindicate these rights that are in the Constitution. And so, you know, there are those two things that are practical, but we're also hoping, you know, what comes out of this from a legal perspective and kind of a, you know, a change of the balance of power in Utah. Like I said earlier, this is supposed to be co-equal power between the people and the legislature. That's what it says in the Constitution. And it doesn't feel that way right now in Utah. There's a rebalancing that needs to happen. And you only get that oftentimes by forcing people to be accountable. And that's sort of a more philosophical answer to your question, Sydney. But the two practical ones are new maps and put the commission back in place.
I don't see any other questions, so I've always been taught to wait 7 seconds to see if anyone has additional feedback or anything. I will just go ahead and say thank you. We really appreciate your time. I've said this a couple of times to people that I've talked to, that Cache County can sometimes feel a little disconnected from what's happening in Salt Lake or in Utah as a whole. So it's been really good for us to just know for ourselves what's going on, but also to give us the language to speak about it with our community and our supporters. So I really appreciate your time. We will share minutes and everything from this with the rest of our listserv for people that can't be here. We are, you know, just right out of school and Memorial Day weekend, so I know a lot of people are traveling, but we will share that. And if no one else has anything, I'll just give a quick reminder that we don't have a meeting in July. We'll meet again the first week in August. We'll send out details on that through our listserv. And did any of the rest of our leadership team have anything to add?
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure to be here with you. Like I said at the start, this doesn't happen unless people are actually willing to put their names on a complaint and fight for it. And so thank you all for giving us that opportunity to do that for you.
Well, we certainly appreciate your efforts. This definitely sounds like it's a lot of work, but we know it's well worth it. So Thank you all. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening, and we look forward to hearing some good news about this, hopefully soon, in quotation marks. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks
Bye.
so much.